Well, tonight we're only going to cover one chapter. It's chapter 10 of the book of Numbers. And we're going to finally move with Israel from the base of Mount Sinai into the wilderness towards the promised land. I called this God's Army Departs from Mount Sinai. I was thinking of alternative names for it, and one that came to mind after I finished the outline was Follow Me, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But before we start the lesson in proper, we have to go back to what we learned last week. And we reviewed the final instructions that God gave to Moses to prepare Israel to start its journey into the wilderness towards the promised land. And remember, God called out Israel not because they were any better than any other nation, but he called them out to be his holy people. And there's a period of time we studied already where God was so angry with his people that he offered to start over with Moses and get rid of the entire nation. He told Moses that he wasn't going to accompany them. He was going to let them go to the promised land by themselves and maybe send an angel in front of them. Be that as it may, God is with his people. He's preparing them for the journey, and tonight we're going to start that journey. Now, the instructions that God gave to his people before they departed from Mount Sinai were basically to restore and keep the harmony and peace among the people, and to make sure that they were prepared in holiness to follow him. God gave Moses instructions to maintain peace and harmony by separating those that were suffering from leprosy or other illnesses that would defile the camp or cause health problems to the camp. He also required all the Israelites to make amends with each other by paying restitution for any defrauding or trespasses that they had to the other Israelites in the community. And we also talked, and we spent some time in discussion talking about the instructions that God gave to Moses of how to deal with a husband who was jealous and not able to focus because he was suspicious that his wife had been cheating on him, but he couldn't prove it. And that triggered some instructions. We learned that God was given the ultimate position of judging whether the woman was guilty or not, and that would be borne out by her ability to bear children. And boy, in our discussion tonight, we talked about the blessing that children have by God giving children to our parents. The next thing is God provided instructions to Moses for individuals who wanted to pledge or set aside their lives to be a Nazirite and what was required for that. They almost were declaring themselves to be a priest, even though they weren't a descendant of Aaron or they weren't from the tribe of the Levites. And then we went into how the princes, through a ceremony in sequence, delivered the wagons and the silver and the gold to the priests, to the Levites, so that they could carry out their duties in ministering and worshiping God. And then we talked about instructions for Moses to have Aaron light up the holy place in the tabernacle. They needed light to work, and they placed the lights there. And so basically the tabernacle became a functioning location for them to carry out their offerings and their daily worship of the Lord. Finally, before they depart from Mount Sinai, we talked about they celebrated the Passover. They had been, this is the first month following the year that since they departed from Egypt, and it was time for them to celebrate the Passover. The main point that we learned from last week's lesson is that before we can serve God, we must remove from our lives all worldly distractions which would interfere with our service, and we must deal and resolve any transgressions with other people that would defile ourselves from being holy servants of God, or which would cause strife and disunity among the church. So this week now, we're getting to the point where we are leaving Mount Sinai, and God is leading his army, his holy people, toward the promised land. And this was all in mind because we know history that this generation that left Mount Sinai is not the generation that went into the promised land. But when they departed Mount Sinai, they were taking a direct route to the promised land. We're going to find out why God chose not to allow them to go into the promised land. But at least at this point, the focus is that they're going to leave Mount Sinai, go into the promised land, conquer the Canaanites, and take possession of the land that God promised to their ancestor Abraham. The main message that I want you to get from tonight's lesson is that God orders the steps of his people, leading them to righteousness and toward the fulfillment of God's promises. However, God's people must remain faithful and obedient to be victorious and to receive God's blessings. He orders the steps of the people he calls. And so we're going to talk about in our outline this departure from Mount Sinai, the trumpet call, the orderly departure, and the two requests that were made by Moses before they departed. Then we'll conclude with discussion questions and lessons and applications. Now, I mentioned that I thought I was trying to come up with a title for tonight's lesson, and it didn't occur to me until after I published the outline that I could have called this lesson Follow Me. Anybody that has been in the United States Army and had served at Fort Benning, Georgia, which is the home of the infantry, knows that as you go into the post, there's a motto that says, follow me. And the whole concept that Fort Benning is to train people in leadership and train officers so that they can lead the troops. And the whole idea is follow me. And in this way, God was saying to the people of Israel, follow me. And so we're going to talk about the trumpet call and then the orderly departure from Mount Sinai. The first thing that we see in the chapter 10 of the book of Numbers is that God instructed Moses to make 2 trumpets out of solid pieces of silver. Now, we know that there's very few of the items that were made that were solid pieces. The lampstand was one of them, the cherubim above the ark of the testimony. But here's another example of solid silver that was used to make these 2 trumpets. They were about 12 to 20 inches in length and had narrow tubes that went out to a flare. And these trumpets were used to make alarm or to call and gather the Israelite people. It's interesting enough that when you look at the Arch of Titus that shows the Romans returning from conquering Jerusalem, not only did they take the lampstand, and that's depicted in the arch, but also the 2 trumpets that are depicted in the Arch of Titus as bounty that was taken from the temple. As I mentioned, the trumpets were used to call God's people to gather or assemble or to sound an alarm for God's people. There's a difference when either they blew one trumpet or they blew both trumpets. And they either blew the trumpets in one long continuous sound, or they blew it in spurts, 3 spurts like ta, 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 3 trumpet blasts. The way that they blew the trumpets signaled what type of call was being made. When both trumpets were blown at the same time in an even continuous manner, all of the adult males of the congregation, the assembly, were being called to assemble at the entrance to the tent of the meeting. So 2 trumpet calls, long continuous, and that would all be a call for all the male men to call to the Lord, to the temple. When only one trumpet was blown in an even continuous manner, only the leaders of the various tribes were called. Those would be the princes and the princes of each of the tribes. When the trumpets were blown to sound an alarm, they were blown in 3 short blasts. And the different type of alarms that the people would be called to would be to celebrate and worship God for their victories over their enemies, to announce and celebrate their holy days or festivals such as Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, to express joy over God's acceptance of their burnt and peace offerings, or to announce the first day of each month of the year, which began with the new moon. This was especially important for the first day of the seventh month, when the Israelites celebrated the Feast of the Trumpets. The trumpets were also blown, as we'll see in tonight's lesson, when each tribe would begin to march in an obedient and orderly manner from their encampment positions, when the Lord lifted the cloud above the tabernacle, signaling that it was time for the camp to break and for them to start moving in the direction that Lord guided them. Another interesting thing about the trumpets is that they were only blown by Aaron and the sons of Aaron before the tent of the meeting. Only the priests, Aaron's sons, would blow the trumpets. This has significance because the trumpet calls were messages that God was telling the Israelites to worship him or to march or to celebrate. And so there's a God inspired alarm or announcement that was made by these trumpets. It was also a symbol of God giving his acceptance, approval, and blessing with respect to the purpose for which the trumpets were being called. So it's a way of God saying, I'm calling you, but it's also a way of God saying, I approve of what you're going to do because I'm calling you. It also reminded the people that they were being called for a divine purpose, for a holy purpose. Think about this. What's going to happen when the trumpet calls for us? In the end times, when God calls us, he's calling us for his divine redemptive purpose. These trumpets were made of silver, and silver is a symbol of redemption, God's redemption. And so we're going to be called to worship God by the trumpet call at the end times. So those are the trumpets that God told Moses to make, and they were used, as we will see tonight, to signal to the various tribes when they were to start marching from their encampments. The next part of our lesson is this departure from Mount Sinai. God ordered Israel to depart from Mount Sinai by lifting the cloud from up above the tabernacle. It was lifted up. When it lifted up, that was a signal that God no longer wanted the people to stay where they were, but they were supposed to follow the cloud, and God would lead his people. In Numbers book, chapter 10, verses 11 through 13, the scriptures say, on the 20th day of the second month of the second year, the cloud lifted up from above the tabernacle of the testimony. Then the Israelites set out from the desert of Sinai and traveled from place to place until the cloud came to rest in the desert of Paran. They set out this first time at the Lord's command through Moses. God is present with his people. God is king, and God is leading his people to the promised land. So this is all started 13 months after their exodus from Egypt, and after they spent 11 months at the foot of Mount Sinai. The Israelites began to march, or as the scriptures describe in some translations, set forward toward the promised land. The lifting of the cloud from the tabernacle signaled that it was time to move. The cloud itself led the people. While Israel marched, the cloud provided also a covering during the day. It covered the whole assembly, so it shielded them or protected them from the heat of the sun. So the first stage of Israel's journey from Mount Sinai to the promised land was a 3-day journey through the wilderness of Paran toward the Kadesh Barnea, which is located in the northern part of the Sinai Peninsula near the Negev, which is occupied by the Amalekites. Remember, the Amalekites are the ones that attacked the stragglers, and they had where Moses had to lift up his hand and Joshua carried on the fight. And as long as Moses' hands were elevated towards God, they had victory over the Amalekites. When his hands started to drop, they started to lose, and they finally had victory over the Amalekites. Well, they didn't destroy the Amalekites. They were just on the edge of where the Amalekites were encamped. Now, I added to tonight's outline a map that shows the Sinai Peninsula. Scholars don't know exactly what route the Israels took or the exact location of Mount Sinai. If you note here, there's a little point. There's several little points in the map that show possible locations for Mount Sinai. And the debate continues even today as to where exactly Mount Sinai was. They also describe by color 3 alternate routes that Israel took to Mount Sinai and from Mount Sinai to Kadesh. And so what we see here is the southern route, which is the dark red line, the middle route, which is the pink line, and the orangish type of route, which is the northern route. And you have the pink route that really puts Mount Sinai in Midian on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba. And then you have the other 2 routes that put Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, either at the top part or at the bottom part. If you look at the upper right part of the map under the word Amalek, you're going to see where Kadesh was. And that's right on the edge of where the Amalekites had their people located. What we see here is we don't think that Israel traveled in 3 full days from Mount Sinai to Kadesh, but they went into the desert of Paran, which is that middle portion of the Sinai Peninsula. So they left Mount Sinai, they went into the wilderness. They're not sure whether they reached Kadesh at that time in 3 days or they stopped, but God was basically, the Israelites were not used to moving. They had been encamped for 11 months. And so God made it easy on them by only journeying 3 days into the wilderness. Now, there's an order to which God had the people move, and we're going to talk about this order. They were in, as you remember, they were encamped around the tabernacle with some tribes on the eastern side, the tribe of Judah, some on the southern side, and then some on the western side, and then some on the northern side. The way that they departed from the encampment is part of the way that God instructed Moses on how to have an orderly movement, much like an army moves, where you have units move in a certain order to their assembly points, from their assembly points to their contact points, and then into the combat. What we see here is there's a Jarichi, which is a encyclopedia, a Jewish source that describes this orderly movement of the Israelites from their encampment at Mount Sinai into the wilderness. And that's quoted on pages 6 and 7 of the outline. In this form and manner they marched, and a most wise, beautiful, and regular order it was. First, the standard of Judah, a camp consisting of 186,400 able men fit for war, then followed by the Gershonites and Merarites with 6 wagons carrying the heavier parts of the tabernacle. Next to them, the standard of the camp of Reuben, having 151,450 warlike men. Next to them were the Kohathites, bearing the holy things of the sanctuary on their shoulders, who were followed by the standard of the camp of Ephraim, which was formed of 108,100 men fit for military service. And last of all, the standard of the camp of Dan, which consisted of 157,000 men able to bear arms, and which had under their care all that were not able, which belonged to the other tribes. Those are the people that were separated from the tribes for various reasons, illness, defilement, whatever. I always think that maybe sometimes with our church, with all the troubles we've had, we might have been in that group that was protected by Dan. The summary is that God specified the order of march as follows. The first and very front was the Ark of the Covenant, carried on the poles by Kohathites. And the kolas, they carried it on poles. If you remember, it was the only furnishing from the tabernacle that was covered with a blue cloth. And so, as I mentioned before, if you ever see the pictures where out in the wilderness they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant and you see the cherubim, that's not the way it was carried. It was covered with a blue cloth. Now, after the Ark of the Covenant that led the procession started with the three tribes led by the tribe of Judah, which were encamped on the east side of the tabernacle, the entrance to the tabernacle. And they're the first to march out. And so would be a trumpet call, a blast. It would be an alarm type of blast, three repetitive blasts of the trumpets. And then the first tribe, Judah, would leave and depart. And then the next tribe of the triad of Judah would depart. And then the next one would depart. And after the three tribes of Judah had left their encamped positions, then the trumpet calls would call again. And it was time for the two Levite tribes, the Gershonites and the Maronites, and they followed the triad of Judah, and they transported the coverings and the boards and all the parts of the tabernacle, and they transported them in wagons. And so after they departed and were finished, the trumpet call would call again, and they were followed by the three tribes encamped south of the tabernacle, led by Reuben, the tribe of Reuben. After them, then they were followed by the Kohathites, which carried the holy vessels of the tabernacle on their shoulders. They had no wagons assigned to them. They carried everything. They started with the Ark of the Testimony at the front of the procession, and the rest of the furnishings, the holy vessels, were carried after the tribe of Reuben. Then they were followed by the three tribes encamped on the west side of the tabernacle, led by Ephraim. And lastly, the three tribes on the north, the tribes of Dan, and plus the people that were separated from the tribes that were separated from the encampment, they were all, they followed the procession. It's probably that the tribes of Dan were at the very back of the procession with the people that needed help and that were not able to walk or needed assistance. They were right there between the tribe of Ephraim and the tribe of Dan. Each group in sequence of the march did not start to move until the trumpet call. And the trumpet call really signaled that the previous group in sequence had finished departing and that they were to proceed and depart. When the cloud lifted, the first thing that was done is Aaron and his sons would go into the tabernacle. They would cover and remove the Ark of the Covenant, Ark of the Testimony, and then that would be given to the Kohathites because that would be leading the procession. And then they would cover all the other vessels inside the tabernacle. And when they're covered, then the Kohathites would remove it. After that, then the Gershonites and the Morarites would then take down the tabernacle, and they would be in a position to start moving. Now, then when the cloud stopped moving, the Gershonites and Maronites who followed the three tribes of Judah, they would be protected by the tribes of Judah. They would start to set up the tabernacle. They would put the boards in their sockets. They would put the coverings on, and they'd be all ready. And that would take a period of time, but they were followed by the tribe from the south, the three tribes from the south, and that would take some time. And then the Kohathites, by the time they arrived carrying the vessels, then they were prepared. The temple would be the tabernacle would be set up, and then all the furnishings would be placed in there. And then Aaron and sons would uncover those vessels and put them in their position in the tabernacle. Remember, only the priest Aaron and his sons were the ones to touch the holy vessels inside the tabernacle. So you could see that this is an orderly procession. I always like to tell people that are not familiar with moving a large group of people that if we were taking a division of American troops and their vehicles, and we were to march them in an administrative march, they would spread out between Reno and Tonopah, covering a distance of 250 miles. So when you're talking about a large group of people, you're talking about a group of people spread out. And we're talking about possibly as much as 3 to 6 million people that were involved in this march. It wouldn't be spread over 250 miles, but it would be spread over a considerable distance. And so logistically, you know that it has to be ordered. And if you've ever been marched in a parade, or you ran in formation or anything else, you know that you have waves where it condenses on the slowest people in front, and then it tags out with the people that straggle. And so this had to be orderly to keep everybody together and keep them marched as they proceed into the wilderness. Each time that the cloud lifted or the cloud rested for this assembly to stop and make camp again, Moses made 2 requests of the Lord. The first request before he did this was he asked his brother-in-law Hobab to help him lead Israel through the wilderness to the promised land. Numbers chapter 10 verses 29 through 31 says, "Now Moses said to Hobab, son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are setting out for a place about which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come with us and we will treat you well, for the Lord has promised good things to Israel." He answered, "No, I will not go. I'm going back to my own land and my own people." But Moses said, "Please do not leave us. You know where we should camp in the desert, and you can be our eyes. If you come with us, we will share with you whatever good things the Lord gives us." Reuel was Jethro. They're the same person. They're Moses' father-in-law. Jethro may be another term for leader or priest in the Midianite language. Habab was not an Israelite, but he was asked to join Moses to help lead the Israelites. Well, we just studied that God was leading the Israelites. The cloud was telling them where to stop in the desert. And the cloud was protecting, and God was protecting the people. So the question is, and the scholars have debated this, you can get lots of literature on both sides. Was Moses showing unfaithfulness or disobedience by asking Hobab to join him? Or was it a reasonable request in light of Hobab? The Midianite Peninsula was one that was known to Hobab because his people lived there. Some scholars go as far as saying that by Moses asking Hobab to join them because he knew the terrain, this signals that maybe Mount Sinai was in the Midianite Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, and not on the Sinai Peninsula. And so a lot of conclusions can be drawn just by this one passage of scripture where Moses is asking Hobab to join him. At first, Hobab refused. Moses persisted. There's no definitive statement in the scriptures that say that Hobab at this point decided to join Moses. But if you look at the book of Judges, who's there? Hobab. And an allocation of land in Canaan was given to Hobab and his descendants. So what we see here is that the Hobab probably did change his mind and join Moses, and he did provide assistance to Moses. Hobab is translated as wisdom. In that translation, many scholars come to the conclusion that Moses was really asking for somebody that he could rely upon and seek advice from. If you remember, when Jethro arrived at the Israeli camp with Moses's wife and children, he looked at what Moses was doing. He was out there trying to judge all the cases, and it was Jethro that advised Moses, why don't you select judges, people to take this responsibility from you? Your job is to lead. You're not to be, micromanaging and judging all these cases. So maybe Moses was looking more for sound advice. Why he didn't get it from other people, we're going to see some of the reasons down the road as we study the rest of the book of Numbers. But as I mentioned, When the cloud lifted and the encampment started to move, Moses would say out to God, "Rise up, O Lord, may your enemies be scattered, may your foes flee before you." God was going to clear the way for the Israelites to reach the promised land. And when the Ark of the Covenant came to a rest and the cloud settled, Moses would say, "Return, O Lord, to the countless thousands of Israel." So each time the Ark of the Covenant, responding to the movement of the cloud, moved forward, Moses would say, "Rise up, O Lord." And every time it came to a rest, he'd say, "Return, O Lord." These same petitions were used throughout their journey through the wilderness. Moses' prayers are reflected as in the 85th Psalm, which relates to the restoration of the promised land to Israel. And it's also in the 68th Psalm, where Christians today really associate that Psalm with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost and with the triumphs of the church on earth. Victory and God's blessing. And so with that, we're now on our way. We started with God asking Moses to make these trumpets, which were used to discipline and call the assembly. God has specified the order of movement from the encampment and to their journey in the wilderness. And then we have God having Moses petition God to have the enemy scattered and flee before them, and to return when they rest at the next encampment. So we're on our way. And now we're going to see, with God in charge, with God, the order and the discipline and the obedience of the people, now we're going to see how it turns out as we study the next chapters in the book of Numbers. But before we conclude the lesson, there are some questions that I wanted to bring, 3 questions tonight. And so we're going to unmute, and of course we're going to follow the same procedure as I'll read the question and then give you an opportunity to respond to the questions by raising your hand and being recognized by the pastor. God was communicated to Moses, who gave the instructions he received from God to the Israelites to follow. The trumpets were used in a manner to call and assemble God's people to worship God and to follow God's instructions. Moses continually prayed to God to lead the Israelites into victory and to remain with the Israelites to bless and increase them in strength and numbers. The organization and discipline of the Israelites showed that Israel was God's army on a holy mission. Every step towards the promised land was led by God and required God's people to be faithful and obedient. When faithful and obedient to God's calling, God's people will have victory and will receive God's blessings. So those are some of the conclusions we can draw from tonight's lesson.
Yep.
Very good.